Well, hello, friends. It's Wednesday, and of course, it's time for us to get together in the Word so that the Word gets into us. And today we're looking at one chapter. It's Acts chapter 27. It's fairly long, and it's very intense in terms of how God is going about preserving Paul despite some terrible decisions on the part of those who are protecting him and trying to get him to Rome. So let's pick up in chapter 27 with verse 21. We're kind of meet halfway in this story. Since they had been without food for a long time, Paul then stood up among them and said, "You men should have followed my advice and not sail from Crete and sustain this damage and loss. Now I urge you to take courage, because there will be no loss of any of your lives, but only of the ship. For last night an angel of God I belong to and serve stood by me and said, 'Don't be afraid, Paul. It is necessary for you to appear before Caesar. And indeed, God has graciously given you all those who are sailing with you. So take courage, men, because I believe God that it will be just the way it was told to me. But we have to run aground on some island.'" All right, so kind of a backstory. Paul, under the watch care of a centurion, has left from the Asia Minor area. Is beginning traveling toward Italy, toward Rome. It's late in the season of travel. It says earlier it's past the day of atonement, which means that the weather is about to transition to a not so conducive conditions for traveling. And most maritime people would have understood that and abided by that. But in this case, the decision was made to go ahead and travel. And it's tough travel. They've endured some pretty hard circumstances. And even though they got to one point where they could have stopped, they didn't. The text says that the harbor was not situated for wintering there, whatever that might mean. But they continued to set sail despite Paul's urging not to do so, that he insisted that the ship's just not going to make it. You guys are putting yourself in peril and in danger. But that's what's so fascinating about this, because the statement he makes, the angel of the Lord appeared to me and said, "It's necessary for you to appear before Caesar." That goes all the way back, I think, to chapter 23, where after several attempts for his life to be taken, Paul is preserved, and the Lord himself comes and stands beside him and tells him, "Hey, you will appear before Caesar. You will make it to Rome. This is my will for your life." And for Paul, there was such a conviction, there was such a belief in the sovereignty of God, such a strong conviction regarding God's will for his life, that even though everything, all the odds seemed stacked against him, even though everything was screaming, "We're not going to make it," Paul looks at these experienced sailors. Paul looks at his those who are traveling with him and says, "Hey, don't fear. I have been told by the God whom I serve that we will be preserved. Through an angel, he has told me we will be preserved." And I love what he says there. I believe it'll be just the way it was told to me. You know why I believe that? Because God had been faithful. Paul knew God's word. Paul knew that all throughout God's word, when he had given a statement or he had promised something, it happened exactly as he declared it would. Even in his own life, Paul had seen how God had preserved him time and time again. God had purposed his life to go from being a persecutor to one who proclaimed his word, to one who'd been delivered from stoning, one who'd been delivered from being beaten with rods, imprisoned, all the things that man and to a degree Satan had tried to do coming against him. God did not allow that to stop his ministry. Even when it seemed like the odds were stacked against them in terms of weather, conditions of the sea, the ability of the boat to stand up, all these things, Paul said, "I believe it'll happen just like he said." And it shows faith, shows conviction. It shows that he believes God to be sovereign over the circumstances of his life. And friends, the same is true for us. I think sometimes we let predictions or we let the severity of moments discourage us and distract us and even sometimes dissuade us from something, when clearly we know that God has called us to that. And if God's called us to that, that means that that's his purpose for our life, that's his will. Then he's going to preserve us in that. He's going to persevere us through that season for his glory. And in this case, that's what he's doing. He's showing these sailors, he's showing this centurion, these soldiers, that Paul is indeed a servant of the living God, that all of these other quote-unquote little g gods that they worshipped were nothing compared to the capital G God that Paul worshipped and represented to them through his word. And trust me, they would have had tons of little g gods, and I assure you, they'd have been worshiping them. And yet they were not in any way changing the circumstances. Paul said, "Hey, the circumstances are dire, and they're going to become even more difficult. The ship's not going to make it, but you will. God has declared it, and I believe it. And let's remember that, friends, that despite our circumstances, despite the difficulty of the situations we may find ourselves in, despite all the odds being stacked against us, and in our minds we reason this can't happen. Well, with man it's impossible, but with God all things are possible. How many times do we read that in the Old Testament and then again in the New Testament with people like the Virgin Mary? How can this be since I've never been with a man? Or would it be with Hannah? All those different situations where by man's standards it was impossible. But with God, all things are possible. And just remember, God has a plan for your life. God has a purpose for your life. He has called you. He has redeemed you. He has now commissioned you to be a proclaimer of His gospel and to be about the business of making disciples, that ministry of multiplication. And so let's stay faithful. Let's stay committed. Let's don't get distracted. Let's don't get discouraged. Let's certainly don't get, dissuaded from God's call for our life. Instead, stay focused, stay committed to the purpose for which God has called you, commissioned you, and now is empowering you to carry out. Well, it's Wednesday. If you need some encouragement, and most of us do, we'll be together tonight. Awana will kick off at 5:45 with check-in registration. Then with 6 o'clock, it'll get going. 6 o'clock, our students will have student-led worship. Following, of course, adults will be gathered together in the worship center for prayer and Bible study. For those of you who are sharing your beautiful gifts of singing with us on Sundays through the choir practice at 6 o'clock as well. Plenty going on, but the main thing is relational connections and connecting to God's Word and connecting God's people. And that's what you need. You need that connection so you can stay strong, strengthened, and encouraged. And that's exactly what we want to do tonight. So I'm hoping to see you tonight. And until we are together, live sent.